Welcome to Introduction to Mobile App Development Module 3, Improving Your App Studio app. Today, we will take a deeper look at app design, including navigation, controls, data sources, and binding. Then, in preparation for the coming modules, we'll discuss Visual Studio and downloading your app code for editing in Visual Studio. In the last lab assignment, you probably started to realize that building your app in App Studio is actually one of the easiest parts of producing an app. In order to build your app, you need a fair amount of resources in the form of URLs, photo albums, search queries, etc. If you are new to building software, this may be your first exposure to the idea that it is best to design your app first before you set about building it. The flow of an app from idea to delivery is called the life cycle. Here, you can see a typical software life cycle as it relates to building App Studio apps. Let's quickly walk through it. The life cycle breaks down to the following. Design your app. That is, plan out things like navigation, what the main sections are, what URLs are needed, etc. Build your app. Once you have the necessary information and an idea of how to organize it, you can use App Studio to build it. Test your app. Preview your app in App Studio, but also on a real device. Distribute your app. Publish your app in the App Store or mail it to friends or coworkers. Gain customer feedback. This is where the cycle part of life cycle comes into play. At this stage, once you've released your app, it's a good idea to keep tabs on how users are reacting to it. Did you miss relevant info that should have been in the app? Is the navigation confusing? Once you've gathered feedback, the cycle begins again at Design Plan. For this module, we will continue to focus on the design. In the last module, we took a brief look at app navigation. Let's revisit navigation in a little more depth. Apps built in App Studio will use panorama-style navigation. The part of Windows Phone app that controls this panorama navigation is something called the panorama control or hub control. It is a list of sections controlled by the hub or panorama control. The hub control will display each section and allow you to move between the sections by swiping left or right. Your various app features will begin and be displayed in the sections in each one of the panorama items. Each section will contain either the information from a data source or a set of menu items. App Studio supports a maximum of 6 sections in this panorama or hub control. If you wish to use more than 6 data sources, you can add sections as menu options, as we discussed in the previous video. Once you start working with apps, in Visual Studio, you might also hear the hub-style navigation referred to as a gallery app, which is a particular type of project in Visual Studio. We will continue working with the panorama control a little more in the demo. As we just mentioned, the hub control can display either sections connected to a data source or a menu. Menus can contain up to 24 options each. The various menu options can link to a wide variety of things. You can link to additional sections that connect to data sources, you can hyperlink to web pages, or you can perform a wide range of actions like dialing a phone number or initiating an email. You can add multiple items to your app through menus, and each one can have a different title. Additionally, you can configure the menu to use one of the 3 different layouts: a list-style layout, one with small icons, and one with larger icons. Section pages are the primary means for displaying your app's content to the user. Let's start number 7 again. Section pages are the primary means for displaying your app's content to the user. Since they are such a key part of an App Studio app, let's review some key aspects of section pages. The most important thing to note about section pages is Slide 7 again, now. Section pages are the primary means for displaying your app's content to the user. Since they are such a key part of an App Studio app, let's review some key aspects of section pages. The most important thing to note about section pages is that they define the layout or look of your app and the layout for each page of your app. In the second module, you learned that each section is associated with a data source. The data source controls what is being displayed, while the section controls how it... There's something wrong with this. Let me pause for a second. Okay, I added a line to 7, and let's start 7 over now. Section pages are the primary means for displaying your app's content to the user. Since they are such a key part of an App Studio app, let's review some key aspects of section pages. The most important thing to note about section pages is that they define the layout or look of your app. In the second module, you learned that each section is associated with a data source. The data source controls what information is being displayed, while the section controls how it is displayed. All sections have a main layout. While some might have an additional layout that is used for a more detailed view of a data item, such as a picture or a record from a collection, both layouts can be configured based on a number of different layout options. We will revisit data sources shortly and focus in on the collection data source specifically. Okay, let's get started and take a look at what the app would look like running. So you can see here, we can start at the first hub item. So as you can see how the page slides left and right. These are panorama if you're using Windows Phone 8, or a hub if you're using a universal or Windows 8 application structure. The focus of this course is using the hub. So the first item here, you can see it's actually a data source. We'll get more into that shortly. In the second collection here is another data source. And we get awards, videos that would load a video inside the app so the user doesn't have to leave the app. But what if they do leave the app? So if we pick one of the items from the blog, you can read it here, or you can select go to source. And now it actually has left your application to open Internet Explorer. But what if the user wants to get back? All they have to do is click back and it'll bring them right back to your app. The photos item here, we'll take a look at this shortly once we go back into App Studio. But if I were to show you one of the items by clicking on it, now we see a details page. This will make more sense once you start seeing the templates. Okay, let's go back to App Studio. Now here's the app that I just showed you running in the emulator. And click edit so you can go back to the main portion of where you would make the editing on your app's content, and that is on the content tab. I've filled all 6 sections. The first section I want to focus on is the team. So this is the first item that we saw. You can quickly take a look at how the structure will look once it's running in this little simulator. Now mind you, if you click on it, it's not going to navigate to the next page. It's just a simulation on what the hub control will appear like once you have your section set up. Okay, so let's go back to the team section. Now, I did this with one of the sample apps. You can go to sample apps and select sports team. Now the sports team, you see the layout where, what if you wanted to change it to show more guys? You could do that. If you wanted to show them like that, you can really display it any way that you like. And then the details page. Okay, whenever you're done making any changes, make sure you always click save. If you don't click save, a pop-up will appear. It will ask you, do you want to navigate away from the app? Always choose no, because that means you didn't click save. We've had a chance to work with some of the key data sources, so let's review them quickly before learning more about collections. Here are some of the data sources we've looked at in Module 1. We took a look at how Flickr, you could use it to create photo galleries in your app, and how you can create static or unchanging content by using HTML. Several other data sources, such as Bing, RSS, and YouTube, can be used similarly to Flickr. The App Studio team will be working hard to add additional data sources, such as the recent addition of Facebook and Instagram. You can learn about many of the other data sources in the video, the ins and outs of Windows Phone App Studio. The next data source we will cover is the most advanced of the set, collections. Collections are user data. Some examples might be a list of cars, a list of products, or a list of museums. Collections are very powerful, so let's look a little bit deeper at them. The user data in a collection is held in a structured form. This means that each thing that we are representing with the data has a fixed set of information. This fixed set of information is referred to as a schema. In other words, a schema determines what information is being stored with each thing that you are representing. Let's use a list of cars as an example. In this clip, you can see I've defined a schema or structure for the data representing each car. In other words, for each car, I want to know the make, model, and year. The schema for a list of products might be, for example, size, color, price, and quantity. In this example, if we also wanted to store the color of the car, we would need to add a new field for that piece of information. By using the Collection Editing tab in App Studio, you can add or remove fields to your collection. We'll take a look at the difference between static and dynamic collections shortly, but for now, let's see how to enter data into a collection. Once you have decided what data you need to have and have consequently defined your schema, you can now add data to the collection. This can be done in App Studio as well. You would use the Edit Collection Data screen, and you can add data to your collection. Simply click Create, New, and fill all the fields. Click Save when done. It is important to note that once you have entered data into a collection, you can no longer change the schema. This means if you decide later that you want to add additional information in the collection, you can't unless you want to recreate the collection from scratch. If you have data that you wish to add a collection to, but it is already stored in another file or database, you can use the Import Data feature to add the data to your collection. The Import and Export Data feature of App Studio makes it easy to populate static collections. Import and export work with comma-separated values or CSV files, like the one shown here. CSV files are widely supported by virtually all databases and spreadsheet programs. If you have Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, you can save it as a CSV file and use it to import into your App Studio collection. Alternatively, you can export the data or just the data schema into a CSV file and then open it in Excel. By using these features together, you can work around the inability to change the schema after the data has been entered into your static collection. To change the schema, you simply export your existing data, then create a new collection with the proper structure. Now all you need to do is change the exported data fields to match your new structure, and then import the data back into your new collection. Now that you know how to create a collection and populate it with data, how do you use that collection? The process of taking one of the data fields and make it display in one of the controls in your app is referred to as binding. When you choose your page layout for a section, you can choose which data fields to display. By choosing the data field, you are binding it to that control. In this example, you can see our schema contains a title and subtitle, which have been bound to the two text controls above the image. So each time you view a museum, the information from your collection will be displayed in those two text controls. Some of the data types you store in your collection can be used in special ways. If you use any of the special data types, you can perform an action binding as well as a normal binding. This means you can have your app perform special actions in addition to simply displaying the data. The special data types are shown here. If you use the email, phone, address, artist, album, or song types, then you can bind an action to that field. In this example, you can see a phone number has been bound to the bottom field. If you perform an action binding to that same field, you can have your app dial the phone number when that is selected. As you can see, collections have a lot of functionality that is pretty potent. Let's jump into App Studio and take a look at working with them now that you have a basic understanding of how they work. Okay, so the team was based on a data source, and the data source is of type collection. To understand this better, let's take a look at that data source. So the collection, as I've described previously, is like a database. It has a schema. The schema here is title, image, and description. And the type is text for title, and image is of type image, and description is of type text, except it's also multi-line. Now this is a static resource, and we'll cover that more deeply later on in the session. Now what if we did want to make changes to it? Once you've already set your data and there is data in there, you can't make changes to the schema. So instead, what you can do is you can empty the collection. And once the collection is empty, you can then make changes to it. So as you can see here, my collection's a little different. So I'm going to delete all the rows. Now it's completely empty. I've just wiped it out completely. Click Save. I'm going to go back. Back again. And I'm going to completely delete it. Now let's add a collection. We're going to choose dynamic resources. And you see here there are no schemas defined yet. So let's click Create New. Call this title. It's of type text and it's multi-line. Nope. Let's create another one. We'll call this the image. It's of type image and it's not multi-line. Create another one. We'll call this description. It's of type text and it is multi-line. We'll add one more. Now this wasn't in the original one, and I'll explain what it is shortly. We're going to add an actionable item, and it's called phone. Now it can be thought of as text, but we want AppStudio to treat it as a phone number, and you'll see that phone is one of the column types. Select phone. Okay, now we've got the schema defined, and we can click Confirm. You can see it's over here. Let's move it back up to where it was before and click Save. Now that it's saved, let's click Edit and dig into what it actually is. So we've defined the schema, but there's no data for it yet. So you can click Edit Data. Now you can sit here and add each row manually and type it in yourself, but that can be a little bit of work if you have a large amount of items. Instead, you can just import data. Now what I've done is I've taken the sample data from that first one, I've exported it, and I've added a phone column. It's uploading now. And in the phone column, I added the phone numbers. Now because I defined a schema for phone, it knew to import the data from that row in the CSV file. Now let's click Save. Now we can exit. Let's come over to Pages. And I want to name this Contacts. Let's click Save again. Sometimes you'll notice that it won't update here. This can be easily fixed by going back to the main page and opening it again. Okay. Now, there's no images there and there's no text. What do we have to do? We have to work on the bindings. So, for the main page, we want the title to be title. And subtitle, we can use description. And image, of course, we'll use image. Alright, that's not bad, but I want it to look a little better. So let's take a look at a few of the other templates. It's not bad, it's a little bigger. I think that one makes more sense. Okay, now what about the details page? How are we going to let the user to be able to make the phone call to one of them? So once they tap on one of the players, they come to this details page. First thing, you'll see again the bindings here. You can know the bindings because they'll be inside of the curly braces. So for the title of the page, we're going to use title, which would be the player's name. The description would be the description. The image will be the image. Title, you would expect would be title, but Phone doesn't look good there either. How about we swap the description with the phone? So let's put description there and phone here. Now that's looking much better. Notice the action to the right of each one of the binding options. If you choose a different template, there'll be less or more actions available depending on how many slots you have for bindings. So for the phone binding, for the action we choose phone. It knew that it was a phone action because the type of column that we have set in the schema was of type phone. Before we leave and save, let's turn on text to speech. And we want it to read aloud the name, which is the title, share text, and pin to start. Let's click save and back out. Okay, it's coming along. Now let's take a look at the photos. And I want to move them up to closer to the front. Click save again and open photos. Now, as I described while I was demoing the app, we can make a different choice when it comes to having layouts. Sometimes you don't always want a lot of information on the page. There's no need to have the title there and the title there. So why don't we just have the template that doesn't have a title because the page already has a title. Okay, let me click save. And we'll dig more into the collections in the next demo in this course. Now that you know the basics about working with the collection, let's discuss the difference between static and dynamic collections. Static collections are simpler. They are simply data that is saved within your app. For example, you might have a list of the states in the USA and their state flags. Because you know that this list will not likely change anytime soon, you can save this collection in your app. The advantages of this are that the app will need to be able to access the data and display the data much faster. It is local to the app and will not need to be connected to the internet to function properly. The disadvantage is that the app will need to be rebuilt and republished anytime that the information needs to be updated or new information becomes available. For example, if a state changes its flag, you would need to update your app. Additionally, if there is a lot of information in your collection, the size of your app could be substantially larger with a static collection. Understanding these limitations makes it easier to understand what a dynamic collection is. By contrast, a dynamic collection will always get its data from the internet. This means the data is always up to date, and you do not need to rebuild your app in order for the data to be accurate. Also, the size of your app will be much smaller because the data is not inside the app. The downside is that your app will require a connection to the internet and could potentially eat up a user's download bandwidth. Understanding the two types of collections is important. Making the proper choice for which type of collection to use is equally as important. When choosing between static and dynamic collections, try to keep in mind how much bandwidth will be used by a dynamic collection and how important it is that the data be updated each time the app is used. Okay, let's take a look at how dynamic collections actually work. We're back at your projects page. I'm going to go into edit for the sports team app and quickly bring up the team collection. We come over and take a look at the data. It's a static resource. This means that it's actually built into the app and deployed to the store. But the second section, the one that I added the phone number to, is actually a dynamic collection. So what does that actually mean? I'm going to build the app now. I'm going to skip the other parts, and I won't go into detail about how to download and set up the source code. We will cover that later in the module. I'm just going to click generate, and you'll see down here on the right it's generating. It'll also show you previous versions. You see how quick that was? And then we click this button to download. Once you click download, it's going to ask you where you want to save it. You pick a suitable location. For me, I have a folder just for the app, so let's bring that up into view. And it'll be called app.zip for every app that you download. You can choose to rename the folder if you want. It's only 2.2 megabytes. It's already downloaded. Now we open the folder. Now before you actually extract it, you always want to unblock it because it contains DLLs and other things that the computer's OS will protect you from. We extract it all into the same folder. Now you'll see a file called appstudio.sln solution. I'm going to double click that. It will open it in Visual Studio. You'll see at the bottom bar, it's a taskbar for Visual Studio. You'll see a progress of the solution being loaded and build time, which we'll see shortly. So this might look daunting at first. Don't worry about it. You just collapse these. First thing you want to do is right click on the Windows Phone project and set as Startup Project. Once that's done, you right click on the solution and build solution. You can see now at the bottom it says build started in this little progress bar with a little build animation. It'll just take a few seconds depending on how large your app is, but generally App Studio apps builds in the same amount of time, so about 10 seconds. Now this is just the first build. Anytime you do a subsequent build and you didn't change a lot or choose rebuild, it's much quicker. Okay, now with the Windows Phone project set as a startup project, we can open it in the emulator. Now back to the dynamic collection. When we see the app load, you're going to notice that both the team, which is the static collection, which is built and deployed with the app, and the dynamic collection, which is in the cloud, will both load in the app. The way the app gets the data is the key difference. Okay, now we see the splash screen. Now this takes much longer than it would if it were the user who is loading the app from their phone installed. It's because this has a debugger attached. Okay, as we saw before, we have the different sections in the hub. Now this first section, if we click it, it loads right up. This is all the data we have in the static collection. It doesn't change unless you rebuild the app with the new data. But what about this data that's coming down? This was that second collection that I showed you. See how there's a phone now? And we can slide through. If I were to click on the phone number, it would actually let the user call. As a security precaution, your app can't just go ahead and dial a number. So it always asks the user if you want to call this number. Alright, now that we've seen how that works, we're going to stop debugging and take a look at App Studio again. And let's go back to the edit page for the dynamic collection. So the static collection's here, the dynamic collection's here. Let's open it up. Go to the data tab and edit data. Because the dynamic collection delivers the data through the user's broadband connection, whether it be Wi-Fi or their cellular network, they will always get the latest. So let's say the team changed and we wanted to create a new player for the team. Let's call him Joe. He is backup QB. His phone number is 1-555-1212, just like everybody else's except much shorter. I don't have an offhand picture, so let's just choose a blank one so we can leave it there. Alright, now this item in your collection is populated. Let's click Save. Okay, we've saved it. Now, let me pop up the emulator again and relaunch the app. All we did was just make a change in App Studio. We didn't rebuild it. We didn't download any new source code. And let's go to the very end. May take a second to refresh. Let's kill the app so we get a new instance. Okay. Edit, save that thing. Edit section. This might take a moment. Let's relaunch the app. Let's take a look at who our people are. Let's click refresh. Now it went to go get more data from the server. And there is Joe, the backup quarterback. And that's it. We can come back into App Studio now and change the collection again. And it will be up to date whenever the user loads the app. Going forward from this point, in the next 2 sessions, we will show you can extend the capabilities of your app beyond what is possible with App Studio. We will learn about the C# programming language, UI design, as well as the XAML markup language. Some of the topics we will cover include designing custom pages and layouts, implementing custom actions, integrating with other phone services and sensors, and enabling user input in the app. However, before we can jump into these topics, we will need to learn how to read your app's source code and how to use Visual Studio. The remainder of this session will help you get started with Visual Studio. Let's revisit the app development lifecycle to see where Visual Studio fits in. As you may recall from the introduction module, when you work with App Studio, you can publish apps either from App Studio or from Visual Studio. The process for moving to Visual Studio allows you to make further customizations in the app code that you cannot accomplish using App Studio. To accomplish this, you must export the code from App Studio and open the solution in Visual Studio. Once you have opened the source in Visual Studio, you will not be able to take the project back to App Studio. For this reason, you will want to make sure you accomplish as much as you can with the app design in App Studio before moving it to Visual Studio. So in this final demo for Module 3, we'll go into a little more detail about the generation of your project and how you get the output from App Studio. So I've gone back to my projects page, and you can either click Generate directly from here, which will do it, but let me start from inside the app because that's where you'll most likely be when it's time for you to generate. So at this point, you've already gone through themes, you're setting your tiles, your lock screen, and your splash screen. And you've also set your publish info, which is here. So then you click the finish button. This will bring you to the generation page. Here you get a nice little preview of what it'll look like. You can play with it a little bit. Now remember, these won't navigate if you click on an item. It's not a running app or a Silverlight app. Instead, it's just an HTML5 widget that lets you see what it'll look like. It's pretty clever. Now at the bottom here, if you've had no generations previously, you won't see anything here, and you won't see any previous versions. So just click Generate. Now here's where the magic happens. You get to choose between Windows Phone 8, which we are not covering in this course, but if you did choose Windows Phone 8, you would see the panorama instead of the hub control, and this would be an 8.0 Silverlight. Now if we were to choose this, which is what we are covering in this course, it is actually WinRT, which is a version of Windows runtime that works on both phone and on tablet and PC. The two options you have here are Publish Package and Installable Package. You cannot choose Publish Package until you've completed the Publish Info tab. On the Publish Info tab, you see the Store Association, and we can go more into that later in the course. But we want to be able to generate this now so that we can get the source code and play around with the app in Visual Studio. So all you need to do is just click Generate at this point. But just to show you, I'll include an installable package. This will allow you to get a package that another user can sideload onto their phone. If they are an App Studio user, they can sideload it. If they're another Windows Phone developer, they can sideload it. Over here on the right, you see the current status of the generation. It's usually very quick, happens in under a minute. And there we go. If we had chosen a publish package, there would be another one of these expandable regions that would show a publish package area. So if we expand them again, the prerequisites. You must do this before you can install the app on your phone without going through the store. And each one has a nice how-to, and the email that you receive after your generation is done has a lot of very useful links and has the file to install on your phone directly. It's very easy to do. You tap on it, it goes to the browser, you tap on it again, and it'll install it for you. The installable package is actually the app. You can download it for a Windows Phone. You can scan this for Windows Phone. For Windows 8, it's a little different. You have to download the package and install it with the package. Now for the source code, just like in the previous demo, you click download. Then you pick a save location. And this is where you would have the folder. And you can see my previous download there. And then you download it. After you're done downloading it, make sure you go to Properties. And there will be an unblock button. After you click unblock, you can unzip it. And then you open the folder and you'll see the packages and everything in there in a solution file. Then you can open it directly in Visual Studio. That's all there is for the demos in Module 3.
Visual Studio is a Microsoft suite of tools for developing applications on the various Microsoft platforms. The linchpin application in this suite is the Integrated Development Environment, or IDE, which is Visual Studio IDE, but is generally referred to as Visual Studio. Using Visual Studio, you can build many types of apps and applications, including Windows Phone apps. Using the IDE, you can build apps from the ground up, or from templates or imported projects like AppStudio app projects. Once you have the project in Visual Studio, you can edit the code and markup that defines the logic, behavior, and UI of your app. Once you have built your app, Visual Studio allows you to test and build your app locally. As you saw earlier in the demos, you can deploy the app to an emulator, a real device, or to the Windows OS itself. Using the emulator, you can test an app as a Windows Phone app with various screen sizes, or on a tablet-type device as well. Visual Studio contains all of the tools and functionality needed to develop apps and software for Microsoft Windows. If you wish to develop for other platforms, such as Windows Phone, you will often need an SDK or software development kit. SDKs are bundles of tools and libraries needed to develop for a particular platform. For Windows Phone development, you must also install the Windows Phone SDK as well as Visual Studio. How the Windows Phone SDK is installed is based on which version of Visual Studio you are using. If you are using Visual Studio 2013, the Windows Phone SDK is included with the package. If you are working with Visual Studio 2012, the SDK can be downloaded for free from http://dev.windowsphone.com/en-us/download SDK. If you do not have a version of Visual Studio, you can download the SDK from the same URL, and the SDK will include a free standalone version of Visual Studio Express 2012 for Windows Phone.
So after you've downloaded the zip file from AppStudio, and you've right-clicked and unblocked the binaries, and you've extracted it, let's dig in, and you notice the appstudio.sln, which stands for solution. It's a Microsoft Visual Studio solution file. What it does is it contains a description of what projects an app has. So let's open it up. And Visual Studio will launch if you double-click on that file. And take a look at that right pane in the Solution Explorer. You can see it loading all the different projects that your app uses. This bottom one here, appstudio.data, is a portable class library. It contains all the definitions for your schema and the data providers for where it gets the data for your app. This lib folder is libraries. It contains appstudio.common.dll, which contains a bunch of common helper methods that AppStudio uses to make your app more efficient without having to rewrite a bunch of code over and over again.
If you notice, there are two projects underneath this one main folder called App Studio. This one here is your Windows project. Downloading an 8.1 app also gives you a Windows 8 app. That's outside of the scope of what we're talking about today. So we're going to focus on the Windows Phone one. If you right-click on Windows Phone and select it as the startup project, you'll see up here on the left that the emulator then shows up as your option to deploy to. By default, when you open the solution, you'll see that the Windows project is set to default. You'll see local machine as the option to deploy to. So let's switch it back. Set up startup project. Once it's ready, right click on the whole solution itself and click build solution, or you can just hit F6. This generally takes between 15 and 20 seconds the first time, or if you choose rebuild. But if you're building subsequent builds, it usually is much faster, about 2 to 5 seconds, depending on the capabilities of your individual machine. Once it's done building, it'll actually deploy to the emulator. You could have done this both in one step by just clicking deploy, but I wanted to show that it actually builds the solution first. So let's click on the emulator. This is going to launch the Windows Phone emulator, which is in and of itself a full version of the Windows Phone operating system in its own virtual machine. So this thing you see me dragging around here is the emulator, but it's really the Windows Phone OS running in a different environment directly on your phone's Chrome. You can interact with it like you would a normal phone. Now Visual Studio, once it sees the connection to the emulator, will deploy the app. There you go. So let's stop debugging by clicking this red button and drop down the arrow next to the emulator. You'll see all the different emulators that you have available for your machine. It came with part of the SDK, and you can add more to these if you'd like as part of a different download for the SDK. That's it. That's all you need to do to get it up and running in Visual Studio and test it on individual emulators.
In the next module, we will be going deeper into the source code in Visual Studio. Let's quickly recap the topics we covered in this module. First, we revisited app design. We talked about the importance of design and the concept of panorama and hub style navigation. You learned about your first control, the panorama and hub control. We reviewed sections and data sources. We also took a look at bindings, and in preparation for the coming modules, we then looked at getting your app source code from App Studio into Visual Studio. The next lab assignment will draw upon the concepts you learned in this module. You will perform similar tasks in enhancing your app with collection data sources and work with bindings. After working with collections, you will then load Visual Studio and your source code in preparation for the next module.